When we look at the peace settlements that ultimately ended World War One, they were a complete failure. So before World War One ever ended, Woodrow Wilson of the United States put together his 14 points. This was a plan for lasting peace after World War One, and a lot of the colonies used it to build support for helping in the war in return for self-determination. Because one of the key ideas of Wilson's 14 points was for Europe to give up control of these colonies and allow them to rule themselves. And so many of these colonies agreed to help, assuming they would get self-rule after the war was over. It also called for things like free trade, more rights for colonies, and also the idea of an association of nations, ultimately what would become the League of Nations. The problem was only about half or so of Wilson's 14 points were included in the final peace settlements. When we look at the results of the war, over 15 million people were killed, another 20 million or more wounded, and it kind of set the stage for this process of decolonization. We're going to see that process begin during the interwar period and culminate just after World War II. It also led to an economic crisis after World War I. High inflation and debt kind of ravaged European economies. Now, the United States came out pretty good after World War I when it comes to the economy, because they go from owing other countries money to now other countries owing them money. And so the US economy actually benefited from World War I. It also led to a loss of prestige amongst European colonies, because Europe had promised self-determination, and ultimately they're not going to grant many of their colonies that. And it had seen these colonial troops fighting against other European powers. And so it kind of gave them hope that they could lead a push for independence and self-determination. When we look at the final peace settlements, it was dominated by Britain, France, and the United States. The Soviet Union, Russia, wasn't even allowed a voice. Germany wasn't even allowed to negotiate. And Britain and France were consumed with punishing Germany for the war. And so that becomes a key characteristic of these peace settlements. Germany was forced to take blame for the war. Germany was forced to pay back war reparations to pay for the war. They also lost a ton of territory. Germany lost a lot of their colonial territories. Austria-Hungary was also punished. They were separated into two separate nations. We're also going to see new states added to Eastern Europe out of German and Austrian territories. So Czechoslovakia would be created, as would Hungary and Yugoslavia. Poland was reborn partially from German territory. So overall, all this treaty did was lead to a lasting legacy of failure and caused a lot of discontent, a lot of bitterness between Germany and the Allied powers. Another downfall of the peace settlement was the lack of self-determination. Even though Woodrow Wilson had pushed for it, ultimately he had to give up the idea of self-determination in order to get the creation of a League of Nations. And Britain and France weren't willing to give up their colonies. And so many of these territories who had helped Britain and the Allies with the promise of gaining self-rule were not granted self-rule afterwards. And so many of these territories were outraged. They felt betrayed by these European powers, and that's going to help lead the push for independence between World War I and World War II. So one of Wilson's 14 points that was included in these peace settlements was the creation of a League of Nations. And so the idea of this League of Nations was that it would be a global entity that could help maintain world peace. It could help prevent future wars and solve global problems that individual nations couldn't. The problem with the League of Nations is it too was dominated by Britain and France. Furthermore, it really didn't have any real power. It could make suggestions, it could set up blockades and impose sanctions, but that was about it. The biggest problem with the League of Nations is that many powers are left out. The United States never joins. Even though it was one of Wilson's big ideas, the United States refuses to join because they were afraid if they joined, it would pull them into more foreign wars. And the US felt they'd got kind of drug into World War I, and they didn't want to get pulled into other people's conflicts. So the United States never joins. The Soviet Union is basically ignored when it comes to the League of Nations. Germany wasn't invited to join the League of Nations for a while either. Now, the importance of the League of Nations is, even though ultimately it failed, it did pave the way for the United Nations to be created after World War II. And ultimately, the United Nations was a stronger version of the League of Nations.